classified report has revealed that Saudi Crown Prince promised pain for the U.S. if it cut oil production. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman threatened Washington with huge economic costs, even cutting Saudi Arabia's relation with the U.S. That was one of the threats. What does this say about the relationship between the two allies? Well, in this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at how the U.S. has fallen out of favor with Saudi Arabia in some sense, and how this strained relationship is a sign of U.S.'s waning influence in West Asia altogether. First, let me introduce our guests. Matthew Ehret, Senior Fellow at the American University in Moscow, joins us from Montreal. Also joining us is Christopher Helali, researcher and political analyst, who joins us from Vershar, Vermont. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Matthew, I'll start with you. Let's have you spell out the scenario for us, or paint the picture for us in terms of what has happened here. What I have is oil prices in part causing inflation and economic pain to the U.S. That's really what started this escalation, so to speak. Joe Biden asking MBS to ramp up production. He said not a chance, and he went ahead and cut oil production back in October of last year. And then Biden threatened him with consequences, and MBS hit back with his threats. Am I correct to understand the scenario to be as such?
Yes, you are, but the chemistry has a lot more to do with the context than is often being portrayed in the media about a Saudi-U.S. issue, since this has a lot more to do with the presence of Russia and especially China in setting a new pace for the broader Southwest Asia as a whole, in which Saudi Arabia has chosen to really embrace the Saudi Vision 2030 and the more BRI look east approach to the strategic comprehensive partnership signed by China first in 2016 and re-emphasized at Xi Jinping's last visit to Saudi Arabia at the end of last year, which has really taken on a new paradigm for not only economics but also security relations in the Middle East as a whole, with building of bridges with Iran, with increasingly Saudi Arabia and many other nations, Turkey, Iraq, that have been increasingly healing because of the presence of this much more healthy paradigm that doesn't involve the U.S. Militarists dividing and conquering for the sake of some oil geopolitical speculative war that's been ongoing for many decades. So seeing Saudi Arabia slipping away and moving towards the multipolar alliance is sending shockwaves in Washington.
You have Saudi Arabia, Christopher, who has said that, you know, we have an okay relationship with the U.S., but when you take a look at this classified document that revealed the threat that was issued, or leveled, I should say, against the U.S. is quite telling. When you have the MBS threat, the Crown Prince saying, quote, he will not deal with the U.S. administration anymore, and major economic consequences for Washington is something the U.S. is going to suffer from. And of course, to cut back on oil production is another thing that he has said, based on the classified document revelation. These are pretty severe threats. It's kind of unprecedented, isn't it?
It is unprecedented, and you have to recognize exactly what my colleague is saying here, is that Saudi Arabia is positioning itself in an interesting way as sort of a bridge between East and West here. And of course, these leaks that came from the National Air Guardsman in Massachusetts, Jack Teixeira, on Discord, as part of that trove of the leaks and classified documents, we see that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was very angry about what Washington was, the pressure Washington was putting on him, and basically lashing out and saying, we're going to inflict economic pain on the U.S. But I think ultimately, you know, whether this was done for a chess move to sort of gain favor, curry favor, and some concessions from Washington, or whether it was an actual position of the Crown Prince, what has to be understood here is that Saudi Arabia is almost positioning itself like Turkey. Even though Turkey is a member of NATO, it is moving itself more to the east and seeing itself more in a traditional sense in the region, like its Ottoman past. Saudi Arabia is doing the same, not necessarily as a 100% US ally, but also saying that China is our largest trading partner. China is the second largest economy in the world, and we need to have good relations with China. And so even though the US, you know, Anthony Blinken was with the Crown Prince in Jeddah just a few days ago, and basically said, you know, we are very worried about the relationship with China. And the Saudis are saying, look, you know, it's just a business relationship. and you have nothing to worry about in terms of our relationship with you. So I think the Saudis are going to position themselves in a strategic way, basically balancing both of these poles of the new multipolar world order that's developing. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen. But I think the Saudis are putting themselves up not in one camp, not in the other, but as strategic for both camps, so to speak.
All right, so let me see. I'd like to go with the threat, if we may here, Matthew, and ask you about the different threats that Saudi Arabia has made. But basically, what do you make of the threats? Cutting back on oil production, which it did again just last week when it decided to cut on oil production. And perhaps you can tell us, I have a list of 3 or 4 items here, how Saudi Arabia can inflict pain on the U.S. I'm trying to ask, I guess, basically, can Saudi Arabia inflict economic pain that hurts when it comes to the U.S.?
Well, the U.S. has, let me answer it this way. The U.S. has created a major mess for itself by its gambit in Ukraine, which has resulted in a lot of pressure to basically cut off all of Europe from direct access to abundant, cheap Russian petroleum and other natural gas products. The hope was, I suppose, in some ways, that some of the pain could be alleviated by Saudi Arabia increasing its production of oil. Now, that being said, Europe is still getting access to the Russian petroleum via third parties purchasing it from either India or Turkey or other countries, or even Saudi Arabia, frankly, for that matter. But I think there is an effort to try to humble the United States right now, which is currently drunk on unipolarism and this ideology of a one-world government with an Anglo-American governing class at the top that will emerge out of the fires of an economic collapse, which everyone who's got half a brain can see is going to be ripping the Western economy to shreds. And I think that there's a desire to try to entertain or bring alive a potential to smack the U.S. into some sense of humble pie eating and join a better, more reliable set of relationships that is being set by the Multipolar Alliance leadership that's premised around building the real economy up, working to build positive relations of industrial cooperation. And we see that with high-speed rail and other industrial enterprises, nuclear power being a big part of that idea of a growth economy, which China is very much in favor of Saudi Arabia going for nuclear and getting out of its dependency upon an entire economy simply on petroleum. These are all good things, and I think Saudi Arabia might believe that they can cause a bit of pain, which they could to a certain degree, but I don't think they want to destroy the U.S. or anything of the sort. I do think they are trying to shake the West up a little bit so that they play in a way which will not involve burning the earth.
Okay, so let's talk about this visit by the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, if we can, Christopher. He took part, he visited the kingdom, and he took part in what was very important, the GCC Group of Persian Gulf Countries Summit. Now, he had a to-do list of Saudi-Israeli reconciliation, Saudi Arabia's interest to launch a nuclear program, dissuade Saudi's normalization with Iran and Syria, and basically mend ties overall with the kingdom. Any success on any of them?
On all of those topics, not really. Of course, the Saudis do not want to normalize relations with Israel. The Palestinian cause and the Palestinian struggle is still very deep and personal for the Saudi people, as well as for the king. So ultimately, there will be no recognition of Israel. And I think that there's a souring of relations with Israel from many partners in the Arab world, save just a handful like Morocco. But I think on the question of nuclear power, Blinken didn't get what he wanted. The Crown Prince did say that they are going to move forward with a nuclear program, and he did. The Saudis hinted at the fact that if the United States doesn't want to help with peaceful civilian nuclear power, the Chinese will, right? And this is key because China is one of the bidders for this project. And the Saudis, want peaceful civilian nuclear power. Now, of course, the United States levels the question and the fear of proliferation. However, many people can look and say, well, wait a second, the Zionist regime has nuclear weapons and the nuclear program, but in violation of the proliferation, right, the NPT and so on. But nobody says a word, and nobody bats an eye from the West. So ultimately, the Saudis want a peaceful nuclear program, and they will do it, and they will get it, whether it's with the Americans' help or not. In terms of rapprochement with Iran diplomatically and normalization of ties with Syria, with the arrival of President Bashar al-Assad back into the Arab League and a guest in the kingdom, ultimately these ties are going to be forged. And behind the scenes, China and Russia are trying to rebuild the Middle East in a peaceful, cooperative, and win-win economic boon for everyone involved. So there's a lot of rebuilding that needs to be done from all these wars, and they are going to help rebuild the region. So of course, when you look at West Asia, the United States is in its twilight in terms of its power and hegemony. And the Saudis are saying, look, you're not from this region, and we're going to do business with people who are in Asia and people who are in the region and people who care, not about regime change and about whether we conform to a sort of a Euro-Atlantic vision of liberal democracy and shoving human rights and everything down our throat, but we're going to build in our own way with our partners and our neighbors in the region. And that's why, in terms of all the topics you mentioned, it was unsuccessful for the United States to gain concessions and to gain what it wanted at the meeting.
If you agree with Christopher, Matthew, why do you think the U.S. was unsuccessful?
Well, I think that as Christopher alluded to, it is an empire in twilight. The only people who don't seem to recognize this are those think tankers and ideologues who have drank their own Kool-Aid in Washington, D.C. and London, who are still holding on to this delusion of past grandeur, and they don't recognize that the world has fundamentally shifted, and their own self-delusion has resulted in them looking really sloppy, messy, and foolish in the eyes of many of their former allies, who are now recognizing that if they want to survive the coming storm, they have to think in a new paradigm, in a new way of thinking about self-interest, security, cooperation, which, again, Beijing and Moscow have provided a good framework, which has won over a lot of nations of the world, and it's a growing list of people waiting to join the BRICS Plus, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Saudi Arabia is a member of the BRICS Bank, and many other institutions which are operating on a very different framework based on real wealth creation, real survival, and it's not angelic by no means, but it is based upon good business, the type of thing we used to do in the West when we still had some sanity many decades ago governing us, and that's long gone. So hopefully there will be, I think Saudi Arabia knows that, and they are vectoring now towards something which will allow them to survive into the long term.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out the logic behind, Christopher, the logic behind how the U.S. thinks that it could come and ask Saudi Arabia, or any country for that matter, to listen to its desires, especially in the foreign policy arena, and just forego what that country wants to pursue. For example, when it comes to the relationship with China, obviously the U.S. feels uncomfortable, for lack of a better word, of that relationship. Now, I'm sure that word needs to be revised, because the second leaked U.S. intelligence document revealed that Saudi Arabia plans to expand its relationship by procuring drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and mass surveillance systems from China. Those are things that the U.S. can provide and has provided in the past. I'm not too sure about the mass surveillance systems, but definitely the missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, etc. Do you think, then again, the question comes, is Saudi Arabia looking to China and that's a done deal, which according to this classified document it is, or is it going to receive bids like it does with any other thing that it wants, off a list of things that it wants to purchase?
I think to answer the first part of the question first, I think ultimately the United States forcing its will on countries, that era is coming to an end. And I think that in the hubris of the past over 20 years of the quote-unquote war on terror, the United States has realized that it has sown destruction in countless countries, name all of them on the list, from Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and so on. And what it ended up doing was revealing the underbelly of the empire, right? It revealed its soft spot. And ultimately, as people were laughing during the beginning of the war, that these people with beards and in caves will never defeat this glorious army and Marines and Special Forces of the United States Empire? Of course they did. Of course, they had the resolve. It was their homeland. It was what they were fighting for. It was liberation struggle, regardless of where it was and who was fighting. So ultimately, the hubris of the empire is what eventually brought it down. And of course, in the meantime, Russia and China and South Africa and Brazil have not spent all of this money on wars. They've spent all that money on development, on cooperation, and on economic improvement of regional partners and global allies. So ultimately, now we come to a point where you have BRICS Plus, you have all of this de-dollarization movement, you have all this money and transactions happening not in US dollars, but in local currency, be it a ruble, yuan, a real, whatever it might be. So ultimately, the US has no power anymore except military force. And there's not a big appetite to use military force outside of the current confrontation with Russia by the US, the EU, and NATO. So I think that Saudi Arabia is looking at this and saying, well, in the old days, in the 90s, we were pressured, or in the 80s, we were pressured because of different things, whether it be anti-communism or Iran or, the big boogeyman who's going to come after us, and the US was providing tons of cash and weapons. Now the US is also asking for human rights, it's asking for democratization, it's asking for all these things. We want to do business with somebody who respects our territorial integrity, our sovereignty, our self-determination, and not to meddle in our internal affairs. Therefore, the Saudis, of course, are going to go to China, and they're going to continue to go there because the Chinese, it doesn't matter to them that it's ruled by a monarchy and a family. No problem. Can we do business? And can we help support regional peace and cooperation? That's ultimately their goal. Whereas the US is interested in more than that. The US is interested in regime change, in promoting its ideology, in forcing its values on countries that don't necessarily have the same idea of those values as the US and Europe does.
All right, so taking a look at what the US provided Saudi Arabia and whether this is going to change or not, which it seems like it's going through a change at a minimum, Matthew. Military protection for the kingdom, I mean, it's still there. I believe that the US still has troops there. And in exchange, it is set for a reliable oil supply from the Saudis, pricing of oil in US dollars, and Saudi support for American foreign policy operations, I don't know if I can say worldwide. But what do you think? Specifically, I'd like to get your idea about pricing of oil in US dollars and whether that is in jeopardy right now.
Well, there has been an obvious broader de-dollarization that has been ongoing in Saudi Arabia's agreement with China to settle oil payments in yuan is a very important aspect of that. There's many other elements to this that go on far beyond the simple region of Saudi Arabia. I would say that the entire system of the US dollar is sitting upon insurmountable bubbles of derivatives and commodity speculation that arose in the 1970s when Kissinger arranged the creation of the petrodollar in the first place as part of a massive economic coup d'etat in a sense, alongside David Rockefeller of the Standard Oil machine that co-ran the Trilateral Commission that was taking over the United States at that same period. So the idea of then valuing the US dollar based upon the fluctuating value of oil on the spot and futures market was something that was based upon converting a once viable industrial US dollar economy that into a speculative debt-based basket case of bubbles that would not be able to sustain itself beyond a certain limitation, at which point of the bubble would be induced to collapse. So it was always designed to be a controlled demolition of the economy that would then send shockwaves of trauma throughout the world that would become dependent and absorbed by this new policy of globalization that ate up and destroyed the small and medium enterprises of much of the former, the transatlantic community, and created a society of total dependency. So that was never designed to be a forever model by those who were taking over control of the U.S. establishment at that time and turning the U.S. ever more into a dumb giant on behalf of British foreign policy for an empire. So now we're at a point where that whole system is collapsing. It is not sustainable. You can't bail out the banks anymore, not much more at least. So that meltdown is something that will cause the US dollar very quickly. It won't be a gradual, slow thing as it has been. It'll be a quick meltdown that'll be impossible to stop when this fire really begins to rip apart the Western economy, at which point vast changes are going to happen at a scale and pace that nobody would expect. And I say this based upon a lot of historical precedents of systemic breakdowns. We haven't lived through one of these for many, many, many generations. So I think that from the top, the leadership of Saudi Arabia has been persuaded that if they're going to survive, they have to set themselves up for a position to quickly adapt. And you can't just unsever yourself from decades and decades of enmeshment in the U.S. military-industrial machine. It's just a fact. You can't do that. Now, they would rather be a bridge between East and West, and I would hope for that too. But if that doesn't happen, then they have to vector quickly with the new system emerging with Eurasia fast. And a lot of African countries, most of the Middle East would be quickly on board with that new policy, and much of South America. It would just be the transatlantic and the Five Eyes that would be left out hanging. Yeah.
All right, I guess we're just down to the last question over here. So you're looking at the Secretary of State that I mentioned, Anthony Blinken's visit to the kingdom, Christopher. And then it's quite ironic and coincidental that you have the reopening of the Iranian embassy in the kingdom. On the eve of his trip, MBS hosted Nicolas Maduro, which is considered a U.S. foe. And we also have the same day that he met with Anthony Blinken, taking call from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. I mean, there's so many things that are against what the U.S. wants when it comes to the Saudis and where their interests are. I'm wondering if this relationship is broken to some degree beyond repair.
I think so. I think it is broken to some degree beyond repair. It'll never be that special relationship that was before, over the past few decades. It has changed now. It's changed drastically. And the U.S. will never just have the red carpet by itself. It will now share that red carpet with China, with Venezuela, with Russia, with South Africa, with Iran now, with many others who will come and be guests in the kingdom and do business with the kingdom. So ultimately, the special one-on-one relationship with the U.S. is no longer the same.
Sorry to cut you there, just fresh out of time. Matthew Ehret, Senior Fellow at the American University in Moscow. From Montreal, Christopher Helali, who was just speaking, researcher and political analyst from Versailles, Vermont. Thank you to you both. With that, we come to an end for this edition of the Spotlight from Miko Vatagwe and the team. It's goodbye.